Shut up, you'll blow my cover. Who's a rookie?
He's my new partner, Detective Murdoch.
Julia. Julia.
Yes?
Julia? Julia. Julia! Julia, are you all right? Julia. I must say, I am surprised to see you here this evening, Julia. Good morning, Julia. Julia, I have something to tell you.
Yeah?
I'm sorry to disrupt you, Julia. Julia, I just don't want you taking any chances. Julia. Julia. Julia, I know that things have become somewhat awkward between us. Julia? Julia!
William?
But, Julia... Julia, it can't wait.
William.
Julia. Oh, Julia, I can do no less.
I know, William.
Julia, have you ever played basketball? Julia, that was your argument. But I will not rescue you, Julia. Julia, should we hear the worst? Julia, could you imagine anything so grand in Toronto? Hello, Julia. Thank you, Julia. I'll begin my investigation by searching for missing persons matching your description. You're right, Julia. This has cheered me up. If you'll please excuse me, Julia. 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 Julia? What is it? Julia, are you concerned about the nature of my relationship with Mrs. Pendry? Julia, I thought we had an understanding. Julia, nothing in this world means more to me than you. Julia, please. I have to know. Julia.
William.
Julia Ogden, will you marry me? Julia! Julia! Julia, what on earth? And I do, Julia. After all, I am here. Julia, I meant to say how good it is to see you. Excellent observation, Julia. 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 Julia.
Detective.
Julia.
Yes?
Oh, hello, Julia. Julia, have a look at this. Thank you very much, Julia. This has been very helpful. Julia, I think you've hit on something. Thank you, Julia. Very good, Julia. Everyone has their story, Julia. I don't understand, Julia. Hello, Julia. Julia, these encounters are all violent. Julia? Julia.
I heard you were back.
Julia? It's quite all right, Julia.
Julia.
Julia! Have a look. You never cease to amaze, Julia. Julia! Goodbye, Julia. Julia. Julia, I admire your principles. Go home, Julia. Julia. Actually, Julia, if you could spare the time, I'd very much like your input on something. Thank you, Julia. That's very kind. Julia, God, please. Julia. Happy New Year, Julia. Julia?
William. I should have seen that he was, in fact...
Julia, you came here tonight to tell me that. Julia, I have seen the future.
William.
It was you. Julia!
William.
Julia? Is everything all right? Julia? What is it? Julia?
William.
Julia?
William.
Julia? Julia, thank you for coming in. Thank you, Julia. Julia?
Ah, Dr. Ogden.
Julia. But Julia, we aren't guilty of adultery.
Yes.
Julia.
William, we will get through this. William!
Julia. Julia, I've reserved a room for us at the Queen's Hotel. Julia. Julia. Everything will be fine. Julia. Julia.
William, are you busy?
It is only one evening, Julia. Julia. My goodness, you look beautiful.
Well, thank you, Detective.
Julia, is everything all right? Julia.
What do you think, William?
Julia, be serious. You are so lovely to me, Julia. Thank you, Julia. Oh, I'm sorry, Julia. For once, Julia, I sincerely hope you're wrong.
Inspector.
Julia, thank you for coming. Julia, it's a matter of some delicacy. Julia, you can't ignore this. Julia. Well, I don't know what we can do now, Julia. Julia, I need to speak with you. Julia, this is becoming serious. Julia, you have to go.
Where?
Julia, you are being stubborn. Julia.
All rise.
Julia, I'll get you out. No matter what happens, I will get you out. I haven't seen much of you lately, Julia.
I know. Not without you.
Julia.
I said not without you.
You saved my life, Julia. Julia.
William. Where I was.
Julia? What is it, Julia? I don't believe your beauty could be lost on anyone of any age, Julia.
Fine, answer, William.
Julia, I didn't know you were here.
William.
Julia. Thank you, Julia. She wouldn't come without you. Oh, Julia, Dr. Bates has not been found. Julia, is it possible Sarah Boson killed herself? Is there something else, Julia? Julia. Julia, please, I'm not one of your patients. Julia, I just don't like butterflies. Julia. Julia.
A fine name. I like it. Something is touching me.
Julia. Julia, there are people everywhere.
How ridiculous it is.
Julia, how are you? Julia, what are you doing here so late?
William.
Julia, listen to this next part, Julia. Julia, are you going to tell me what we're looking for? Oh, I'm sorry, Julia. We, Julia?
Yes, William.
Julia, you are brilliant. Well done, Julia. As am I, Julia. Julia,
Yes?
I do think we should do this more often. Julia,
William.
what a pleasant surprise. Julia, I have something to ask you. Julia, please, let me in. Julia! Julia, please! Julia, what on earth is going on?
William.
Julia, thank you for coming. Julia, I was hoping that you would...
Yes.
Julia, what brings you here? Julia? Julia? Julia Ogden, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Julia, please do try to stay out of trouble. Julia, thank you for coming. Julia. Julia, I know your convictions. You don't have to do that for me. Think of this, Julia.
Of men and of angels, but
Julia.
have not love. I am anointed God.
Yes, but Julia, this honeymoon is my gift to you. Julia, really, I am so sorry. Julia? Julia? Julia, are you sure? Julia, their actions are mystifying, Julia. Julia, we're husband and wife. We stand together, no matter what comes our way. Oh, Julia, come and join me. The tea is here. Julia! Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Julia. I'm sorry, Julia. Julia, I'm not sure a history lesson is going to help me solve this murder. Julia, would you believe me if I told you that I'm not from here?
Yes. I would believe you.